Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 53 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Colorado Avalanche, in which the Sharks have won 3-2. So in typical San Jose Sharks fashion, they end up being mathematically eliminated from the playoffs with their previous overtime loss to the Colorado Avalanche. And so, of course, from that point forward, the Sharks decide it's time to actually win some games, and they get this victory, the full 2 points in regulation here tonight. And this first period starts off maybe not so fantastically for the San Jose Sharks. By the end of the 20 minutes, however, the game is still tied at 0. Neither team managing to pull through. The Sharks had some nice looks on some power plays, and the Avalanche had some really nice looks at 5-on-5, but both goaltenders playing pretty well. In the second period, we wouldn't see too much action until the last few minutes, where the Avalanche would get two rather quick goals, one coming from Tyson Jost and the other from Andrei Burakovsky, the player who scored the overtime game winner in the previous game. And so the Avalanche had a 2-0 lead, and it looked like they would carry that into the third period. And so the Sharks would end up being tasked with the exact same thing that the Avalanche actually managed to do in the previous game, which is to come back from a 2-goal deficit in the third. But the San Jose Sharks had something to say about it, and it seems as though the only line that actually is relevant for the Sharks in these past few games, the Hertl, Barabanov, and Kane line manages to score in the dying seconds of the second period to make it 2-1 and make the comeback a lot more possible. In the third period, the San Jose Sharks managed to get a pretty early goal in the third period to tie up that game, another one from Tomas Hertl, and then soon after, Erik Karlsson scores on the power play to make it 3-2. And the Sharks do a very good job at defending from that point forward. The Avalanche honestly just not really getting too many chances after that, because the Sharks were defending quite well, especially in the last 2 minutes when the Avalanche finally pulled their goaltender God Grubauer out of there and got 6 players on the ice. You would expect that Makar, Rantanen, Landeskog, McKinnon, these players all on the ice at the same exact time would be able to run circles around the Sharks defenders like they had been doing for the previous 3 games of this mini 4-game series. But instead, it was Burns, it was Ferraro especially, making some really solid defensive plays, as well as this Kane, Hertl, Barabanov line, and it prevented the Avalanche from getting much of anything generated. And as such, the Sharks would not only get this victory, but would actually dish the Colorado Avalanche their first loss this season in regulation in a game where they came into the third period leading. So that was a pretty impressive feat. First thing to talk about would be Kochenash, as he gets the start here tonight. Basically zero surprise after the performance Martin Jones had a couple of nights ago. And Kochenash, a very solid performance to say the least. This first goal from Tyson Jost didn't really have too much of a chance on. I will say this, obviously, I called out Martin Jones for some bad goals in the previous game, and so it would definitely be unfair, even in a very overall solid game from Kochenash, to not call him out for bad goals. And this Burakovsky one was exactly that, kind of similar in a way to the one that he scored in the previous game against Martin Jones in that overtime for the game winner. This one, though, is not even going through the skates of a defenseman, so there isn't even a partial screen, just Kochenash not really being able to get his glove on this puck. So not a great one to let in, but otherwise in the game, Kochenash was very, very good, and he gets a victory here, and he's been a lot better for the San Jose Sharks through the first 2-3 games of his career. Just a few weeks ago, Kochenash, he wasn't necessarily looking all that fantastic in my eyes. He looked kind of shaky at times, and I wasn't really seeing a future, number one goaltender for the San Jose Sharks. And I don't want to jump to conclusions just yet, but over these past few games, he's been significantly better. It's been basically a night and day comparison from where he was just a few weeks ago, and maybe those projections can actually come true at this point. When it comes to who will play for the following game, that game will of course be on Friday, and that would be the final back-to-back of the season for the San Jose Sharks. And we saw last weekend it would actually Martin Jones who got the game on Friday and Kochenash who got the game on Saturday. But considering Bob Booner still seems pretty steadfast in Melnichuk getting a game at some point, and there's only 3 games remaining on the schedule for the San Jose Sharks, I suspect we're going to actually see a combination of Kochenash and Melnichuk get that back-to-back, and we may very well have seen the final game in Martin Jones play not only this season, but considering what could happen in the offseason, we may have also seen the final game Martin Jones will play for the Sharks. Moving on, let's talk about Chmelevski as he comes into the lineup here tonight, as he takes the place of Ryan Donato, a player who I've obviously talked, well, also technically John Leonard, but let's talk about Ryan Donato here, because he's a player who I've been tracking over the past few games. He's been stuck basically on the fourth line, getting very, very low amounts of ice time. In the previous game, I talked about how he had gotten less than 6 minutes of ice time that game, and I said, how much lower could he possibly go? Well, Bob Booner certainly says he can go much lower than that, as not only does he get less than 6 minutes, he gets 0 minutes because he gets benched for this one. You know my opinion on that, but let's move on to Chmelevski, who honestly wasn't all that bad in this game. You know, it wasn't like anything that was blowing me away. He's not like Balcers when he first played with the Sharks. He's not like Barabanov when he played his first game with the Sharks a few weeks ago, but let's just say Chmelevski is certainly not looking out of place in his position. Of course, as it is the case always with Bob Booner, we didn't actually get that fantastic looks at Chmelevski getting less than 9 minutes of ice time here, even though the Sharks are completely and utterly out of the playoffs. You know, I'm not expecting Chmelevski to get 15 minutes on the night, but you would think he'd at least be able to hit double digits in a game that literally does not matter. And technically, even though the Sharks don't want to say that, and the Sharks players definitely don't want to have it happen, technically it is in their best interest to have actually lost this game, but Bob Booner seems still 100% committed in getting the 2 points, and so players like Chmelevski are left with limited ice time, even though he, as I said, looked pretty good in that limited amount of time. And next, I'll bring it to Milosh, who also steps into the lineup. He has played a few games already this season. He comes in for Christian Jaros, who had gotten the last 2-3 games as that sixth defenseman, while Radim Shomek still remains out with an injury and potentially is looking like he may in fact be out for the rest of the season, considering the rest of the season is only a few more days at this point. And Milosh, like Chmelevski, was given some pretty sheltered minutes, was given very, very limited ice time, just over 9 minutes of ice time for Milosh. And just like Chmelevski, while he wasn't blowing anybody away, the good news is, of course, that as a defenseman, you're not really expected to be blowing people away in that regard, and you're more so hoping that you don't stand out, I guess you could say. And Milosh didn't really stand out in this game, so I guess it was rather average, and it'll be interesting to see who gets that sixth defensive spot over these last 3 games. Will we see Milosh again? Will we go back to Jaros? Maybe we could see someone else. Pashasnuk could get another one. Merkley could get up, or maybe we'll just go back to Greg Pateryn. We will see. And finally, let's talk about Tomas Hertl. Earlier in this video, I mentioned how the Sharks over these past few games have really only had one really relevant line, and that has been the Evander Kane, Barabanov, and Tomas Hertl line. And I've talked about Barabanov a ton over the past few games. I mentioned Evander Kane as well a couple of games ago. And so tonight I will finally mention the third player on that line, which is Tomas Hertl. He played his 500th game in his career tonight, scoring 2 goals, which was obviously very nice for him, and actually getting 3 points. He got an assist on the Erik Karlsson one as well. And it feels honestly like it was just yesterday where Tomas Hertl was scoring, 4 goals in a single game in his 3rd ever NHL game, and essentially, forcing Martin Biron into retirement. It really feels as though Hertl is still a very young player, when in fact, I won't call him a grizzled veteran, but playing 500 games in your career is still, you've certainly been around a few times. And Hertl this season, coming into this year, I've talked a lot about Kane, how he's been the best player for the San Jose Sharks. I talked a lot about Couture, how early on in the season he was definitely right up there with Evander Kane, but lately he's left a bit to be desired. I talked about Timo Meier, who I at one point called him the biggest disappointment for the San Jose Sharks this season. Tomas Hertl has honestly been kind of floating in between all of these definitions, I feel as though he's been kind of close to Timo Meier, where I have been at times disappointed with Tomas Hertl. There have been a lot of games where he's kind of been a passenger. His defensive game as well has left somewhat to be desired. I feel as though in previous seasons he had been a lot better defensively, but at this time, I don't know if there's like an injury there or anything like that, but he just seems a bit more lost than usual. And yet, in the end, he still has 19 goals on the season. It's still extremely impressive. And so Tomas Hertl's just innate talent, his innate skill, has still, even in a season where I don't think he's actually been all that great, has actually still been able to carry him to a relatively successful statistical season compared to someone like Meier, who has not only been on the eye test quite poor, but also on the score sheet as well. However, I should mention that Tomas Hertl has looked a lot better since being put with this line, since being put with Kane and Barabanov. And over these past few games, he's looked significantly better, and I do hope that that can continue over these last few games of this season, because Tomas Hertl's contract is actually up over these next couple of years. And I know there's been a lot of talk about people wanting a full rebuild for the San Jose Sharks, where any player who isn't Mario Ferraro gets traded, and that has at times for some people included Tomas Hertl, but I feel as though that might be crossing a line, I would say. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Friday, where they will take on the Arizona Coyotes. And while the Sharks at this point are completely out of the playoffs, as I said earlier, they can actually play spoiler to the Arizona Coyotes if they want to, and I guess help the St. Louis Blues get into the playoffs, which is probably not something that they would like to do. Honestly, I hate the Blues more than I hate the Arizona Coyotes, but then I guess we'll see what happens. As I mentioned earlier, in typical Sharks fashion, it wouldn't surprise me if they got the victory on Friday. Class dismissed.